December 2nd, 2017 marks the 75th anniversary of the first chain reaction. It took place here in Chicago at the University of Chicago in the squash courts, famous experiment done by scientist Enrico Fermi and his team as part of the Manhattan Project. That experiment let the nuclear genie out of the bottle. And now, 75 years later, we're discussing, was it for good, for bad, in between? We can go over some of the goods of what that was: nuclear medicine, rockets to planets using atomic engines. Some would say the so-called too cheap to meter electricity, which of course we don't have, but that's what they promised us. But we also have to look at the downside of the nuclear age and what it brought to us. The destruction of 2 Japanese cities and 250,000 people, tens of thousands of contaminated uranium mining sites throughout the American Southwest and in the indigenous lands in Australia, Canada, Niger. You have to look at the nuclear disasters that the nuclear age has brought us, such as Windscale, England, 3 Mile Island in the United States, Chernobyl in the Ukraine, Santa Susana in California, Fermi 1 in Michigan, the Mayak Soviet Union disaster in the 1950s, and within the last few months, the Mayak Russian disaster, which has just taken place. And then finally, perhaps the most notable, the Fukushima disaster in Japan. When people look at the nuclear age and look at these things, you hear a lot of terms about RADs and REMs and tons of contaminated water and thousands of contaminated bags. Lots of thing talk takes place around the nuclear age. But I think at the 75th anniversary, it's time that we take a look at the people and how the nuclear age has affected the people of the nuclear age. So today we have 2 very distinguished guests with us who are going to examine the topic of where are the people. We're going to examine the topic from Fermi all the way up to Fukushima. So with us today we have Dr. Norma Field, Professor Emeritus, formerly at University of Chicago, Department of East Asian Studies, okay? And Arnie Gunderson, who is a nuclear engineer, former utility VP at one point, and now with Fairwinds Energy Corp., which is based in Vermont. Both have decades of experience dealing with the nuclear issue and examining it from the standpoint of where are the people. And that's what we're going to do today. So why don't we at least get a little bit of background about you. How did you first interface with the nuclear age? Arnie, you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I was a true believer. My mother took me to see the Nautilus when I was 9 years old, and
the Nautilus
was the submarine, the nuclear-powered submarine that went under the polar ice cap. And I had the autobiography of Enrico Fermi when I was 12. So I went to college. I was good at math and got into nuclear power. But in the 70s, I was a religious fervor for nuclear power. In the 70s, we were running out of oil. We had lines for cars, and nuclear was supposed to be the new energy source. And I rose from an engineer to be a senior vice president. And then in 1990, I saw the ugly underbelly of nuclear power when I found license violations and told the company I worked for about them, and I was fired and sued for $1.5 million, driven into bankruptcy and foreclosure and the rest. So it's an industry, an executive in the industry said, Arnie, in this business, you're either for us or against us, and you just crossed the line. So for the last 25 years, I've been consulting for non-governmental organizations like yours about the hazards of nuclear power.
And that's what Fairwinds does.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Norma, how did you get involved with the nuclear age?
Mine's a much more naive one. It comes from being born and growing up in Japan. As a parent in California, when I was giving a college tour a number of decades ago, said, "You are one of them war babies," meaning that my father was part of the U.S. occupation and met and married my mother. And the regular breakfast table conversation was about Pacific testing. And my mother was adamantly against it, the testing, thought it was dangerous. My father kept saying, "We need these weapons to get those commies." And I knew whose side I was on from the very beginning. So there was without knowing what it really stood for, I was afraid of what splitting the atom meant. And when I was it wasn't until I was about 10 years old that I actually saw, this would be 1957, when I actually saw footage of what that mushroom cloud did to people on the ground, because during the occupation, none of that could be shown. And it took Japanese citizens buying back footage by pulling their yens together. And when that was shown on TV, I thought, this is terrifying. How can we go on like this? And that launched me on it solidified my identity as being absolutely against having nuclear weapons of any sort. And then when I was starting high school, college, the Japanese government, having been seduced, having its own desires too, to take on nuclear power, went on a campaign to try to get Japanese people over their nuclear allergy so Japanese could catch up with the rest of the world and get in on nuclear-generated electricity. And I thought, this is very strange to get people over anxiety about something that's life-threatening, i.e. nuclear power. Without knowing the science, I did not believe that this was a separate technology from nuclear weapons. And it's that really got me to care about Chernobyl when it happened, cared 3 Mile Island when I was in graduate school in New Jersey, and then Chernobyl, and then with Fukushima, it coalesces everything. In some ways, it coalesces everything I've ever worried about in my life.
In one spot.
In one spot, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You referenced something, a nuclear allergy, I think was the term you used. Describe that a little bit more, would you?
Nuclear allergy, I guess the updated term is radiophobia or nuclear phobia. It was to be worried about the impact of exposure. Was treated as an allergy. That was literally the word arerugi used in Japanese by the government. And that was what people had to be educated to overcome. Be educated, become scientific, stop worrying about exposure because it's not going to hurt you.
We'll come back to that in a little bit.
Yeah.
So the viewers are really lucky to have both of you here because you both have had very recent experiences over in Japan at Fukushima. So I want to give you an opportunity to just tell us a little bit about what you observed and where were the people that you encountered there. So,
well, I guess my takeaway on 4 trips to Japan, totaling 2 months over the last couple of years, is the inhumanity of the Japanese government to its own people is appalling. It's about money. It's about the big banks, and it's about the nuclear utilities getting their money back. And in the process, what they've done is they've allowed people to receive 20 times more radiation than they were allowed to receive before the disaster. I mean, I've seen radioactive schoolyards that have radiation levels 70 times what was normal before the disaster, and kids are playing in the yards. Radioactive wild boar are running around like deer everywhere in the province now because they can't be eaten, and nobody wants to shoot them because they're so radioactive. And of course, 160,000 people were moved out and are relocated outside of the highly radioactive areas. And now the government wants to have all of those camps closed by the 2020 Olympics. And what they're doing is they're telling people it's safe to go home, and people are saying, no, I don't think it's safe to go home. And the government's response is, okay, then we're going to remove your stipend. We're not going to pay you to stay out, but if you go home, we'll continue to pay you. So they're using money to leverage people back home. Now, I've got 2 grandkids, and I've told my son if he lived in Japan, which he doesn't, I would tell him, pack the kids and immediately leave the Fukushima prefecture. Prefecture's like a state. It's not safe. It's not safe for young people, middle-aged people. You know, old people like me, it's okay. I mean, I'll die of something in the next 20 years anyway. But for young and growing families, it is not a healthy environment.
Norma, you were there also recently.
Yeah, I was just thinking with what Arnie just said about get your young out of Fukushima. There's a movement now, and you can find a website that says, go west, come west, meaning Tokyo's not safe either. and therefore move further west, like to the Kyoto, Osaka area. And those in the know are said, don't aspire for Tokyo University, which is like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, Stanford wrapped in one for Japanese aspiring parents. But you know, the place to aspire for is Kyoto University. So there is a subterranean sense that places are not safe even that far west. I mean, Tokyo isn't that far west, it's a small country, right? What I felt from the beginning is how hard it is to talk about the disaster when you're in Japan. In Tokyo, people have largely stopped being interested in it. In Fukushima, the tension is so high that it's hard to talk about. That, to me, is the immediate human impact of how those who are most victimized are alienated from their own victimization. Why?
And this sort of thing happened with the bomb survivors, the hibakusha, as well. Is this a new generation of hibakusha?
It's a new generation of hibakusha, and right after Fukushima, when people tried to use that term, they would say, oh, don't use that term. It's discriminated against people of Fukushima. Here's a particular place where this comes to a head. A number of years after the atomic bombs, a health booklet was issued. Now, you know, you have to prove you were within a certain circumference of ground zero. But what it meant was that you could get free medical care for the rest of your life. This is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I didn't learn until about 20 years ago that many people who were entitled to the booklets did not claim them. Why? Because they were afraid that by claiming the booklets, the health booklets, their children would be discriminated against in marriage and employment. Now, people, those who have the courage to address these things, feel that there's a need for a similar health booklet in Fukushima. But how can you get a Fukushima health booklet in place without inviting further discrimination? So it's wherever you turn, there's a bind. You know, can you look after your health, your children's health, without risking their discrimination, which is also going to cause psychological burdens? People's hands are tied, their mouths are sealed. That's the most painful part of being there.
I met three people that stand out in my mind. One was a woman whose hair fell out. She had nosebleeds for 2 months, and she had speckles on the exposed skin. And her doctor told her, no, it's not radiation, it's stress. I had another woman who left in a hurry because she heard the sirens go. And she ran barefoot across her lawn. The dog followed. The two of them jumped in the car and drove to an evacuation center. She was too radioactive to be admitted. Her feet turned black for 3 years, and the dog died within about 2 weeks of the exposure. And the third one was a fisherman who didn't hear about the disaster until he came into port. So he was offshore, and he noticed he had a strange suntan and sunburn. And not one layer like a normal suntan, but 4 layers of his skin started to peel off within a couple days of the disaster. And yet the Japanese don't want to talk about that experience outside of the prefecture. And doctors are forbidden to write on their diagnoses radiation illness. So the epidemiological record, if you go back in to try to find who died of what, there's no medical records being left behind that allow a good scientist to develop an epidemiological record.
So this is reminiscent of after the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet government dealing with the liquidators would prohibit any reference to radiation-induced illness or something. So the records themselves are skewed. And the second piece that comes up in terms of Japan, you would know better about this, is how do you find a control group in an area that's totally contaminated? Where do you reference this? Is this
well, the control groups are becoming harder to find because now Japan is shipping its radioactive refuse to places further away to be burned. So they're actually spreading out the radiation amongst all the Japanese as opposed to keeping it concentrated in the prefecture. So epidemiologically, we're going to see more cancers throughout Japan because that radiation's been spread.
And Arnie, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't it a bad idea to incinerate radioactively contaminated things anyway?
I don't have to correct you because you're not wrong.
And to do it all over Japan is,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know, there's two problems. One is you've got, right now, they've cleaned up 5% of Fukushima prefecture, the state of Fukushima. And that's about the size of Connecticut. And only 5% has been cleaned up. And it generated 30 million tons of radioactive waste. And so now those bags are being burned, and they're either throwing it up or collecting it as ash, which then goes into the ground and into the groundwater.
So when you have ash, you concentrate what was there before because you're reducing the volume.
Yes, yes, yes. And either way, they're spreading out that radiation into either the groundwater or into the air once again. Yeah.
So it's equal unfairness for all, would you say?
Well, it is and it isn't, because then there are people who can afford to get food from elsewhere that's less. There is no equality wherever you look. And I remember asking Arnie once, what are those chimneys doing on the bags? And it's to vent the gases, right?
You'll see these bag farms, and they're amazing because each bag is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet and weighs a ton. And it's loaded with contaminated soil, contaminated leaves, whatever. And so that when they put these bags into piles, then they may be 100 long by 100 wide by 10 high, and they've got these mounds. All of that stuff develops heat internally. You know, you're breaking down organic stuff and creating heat. So then they put pipes in to ventilate those gases to prevent the farms from these farms, to prevent the bag farms from catching fire.
And then now, because these pipes were kind of conspicuous, when I returned a year later, I noticed that they had exchanged them for valves that are much more discreet on the side. So the energy and money spent on concealing is immense. There's no end to it, because there are always going to be problems that you have to keep containing. And the Olympics, I like to think now that the Tokyo Olympics have been weaponized to make further revelation very difficult, because what
do you mean by weaponized?
Yes, the Olympics. The Olympics are, first of all, they're a big hammer held over the head. Why do evacuees have to return? Why have their housing subsidies been canceled? Because the Fukushima disaster truly, demonstrably has to be declared over by the Tokyo Olympics. You can't have evacuees who might be talking by then. So you try to make it very difficult for people to stay away. You make, because the Olympics are supposed to stimulate the economy, to criticize that, to point to any problem on the ground in Fukushima is to jeopardize economic recovery, which the Olympics are supposed to be about too. So anything you say that demonstrates your anxiety, it goes all the way back to school lunches when, to help Fukushima recovery, school lunches, let's go back to locally sourced materials. If you're a parent worried about having your child get a school lunch from locally sourced goods, you can go to the classroom teacher who will say, that's fine, you know, you can send your own so-called safe rice with your child, but note that all his or her classmates will be eating the regular lunch. So wherever you look, any expression of worry about any aspect of life in Fukushima will be deemed bad for the Olympics and bad for the economy. So it will be your neighbors who are surveilling and censoring you in the first instance. It doesn't even take the government.
There's an engineering term, maybe you're more familiar with it, Arnie, the normalization of deviance, where you have a standard and you test to that level, and if it doesn't fail, or if you test at a lower level and it doesn't fail, that becomes the new standard. Are we ratcheting the radiation standards to meet economic means, not just in Japan, but worldwide with the nuclear age?
I think there's worldwide pressure to increase what scientists would say was allowable. When I went to school, what was allowable has been steadily ratcheted up over the years. The American EPA just changed their standards to say that if there is a nuclear meltdown near you, we're going to allow 20 times what you used to have allowable, and that's going to be just fine. And that's not about saving our lives, that's about saving the money to clean it up. I just did a peer-reviewed paper in Japan on the data I collected over there. And what it shows is that compared to America, the middle of all the data, something called the median of all the data, is 1,000 times more radioactive than compared to America. But then beyond that, the average is 10 times more radioactive than that. So we're at 10,000 times more radioactive than American soil in Japan. And what's more frightening still is that 5% of the samples are 10,000 times more radioactive than that. And the dose community, the people that establish what's allowable for you and I, aren't taking that into account. They're basing it back on the median, the middle of the road number. And we're finding numbers that could be 10,000 to 1,000,000 times higher.
So where you set the bar matters.
I think so, but it's very hard to get compliance with the Japanese government's own standards, of what is permissible, right? So an exception has been made for certain parts of Fukushima, that these people are meant to live with 20 as opposed to 1 millisievert per year now. And they have a lawsuit, but it is blatantly unconstitutional in treating one part of the population differently in terms of their right to a safe, a healthy, and cultured living, is what the Constitution says.
After Chernobyl, one of the big concerns, certainly it was legitimate, was the issue of thyroid.
Yes.
Thyroid disease. And the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and WHO collaborated together to say grudgingly that, well, yes, there might be 4,000 to 6,000 cases that emerge and people would die, but thyroid disease is treatable. It's not a big problem. That's a rather glib pronouncement if you don't have it to make, but that was the attitude at the Chernobyl disaster. What's happening in Japan on the level of thyroid?
What's happening? I just looked up. I think right now the acknowledged number of child and youth, that is to say, some children and youth and also now adults who were 18 and under at the time of the disaster, is 193. Confirmed or suspected. The suspected means they haven't had surgery yet, so the report, the biopsy report from the surgery isn't in yet. But in every case where surgery has taken place but one, malignancy has been shown. I think one thing that people ignore, and one thing I learned only from the Fukushima example, is that people like to say, again, when it's other people, thyroid cancer is the best kind you can get. I still remember that being said, I guess by Professor Jerry Thomas in London, right after Fukushima on NPR, because it's so treatable. Well, it turns out with these young people, thyroid cancer seems to proceed differently. That is to say, it metastasizes to distant organs, and there's solid tumors that are affected, and recurrence has been shown. And so it's not a wonderful cancer to get, it turns out. People are, the Fukushima Prefectural Health Authority is adamant. They keep saying, it is difficult to think that this is caused by the nuclear disaster. That is the only language they will use.
Is there an accurate translation for Occam's razor in Japan? I'm curious.
What I experienced over there, the normal for a population that size should be less than 10 thyroid cancers. So you're at 200, so you're 20 times normal. Clearly, there was a reason for that.
So this is an example of normalizing the deviance. That'll be the new standard.
Yes.
It's okay for everybody.
And of course, the Japanese are saying, well, the reason we have all these cancers is because we're looking for them.
Yeah, the screening effect,
Yeah.
which is in the, but they don't, the arguments that are made are not, like there was a big a study in South Korea that's now being summoned as evidence that it's a screening effect. But that, I don't see age breakdowns in that. You would think a scientific attitude would be to say, let's keep studying it, instead of saying, denying outright a relationship, even a correlation, not even causal effect.
And that's
Now, we only have a few minutes left,
Okay.
and I think we've used Fukushima as an example of all of the various aspects of the nuclear age that don't often get talked about. There are some who think that the nuclear age really is ending. It's over. No more new reactors in the United States. Of course, we have a lunatic with the finger on the button on both sides of the Pacific at the moment. That could change the argument. Where are we heading? Is the nuclear age over, and what does that mean for the people moving forward? Why don't we start with you, Arnie?
Well, money is talking, and it takes an enormous amount of time to build a nuclear plant, and no one has ever built a plant that came in on time and on budget. So they're terribly expensive, and they take terribly long to build. So if you're looking at the global warming, global climate change issue, building nuclear plants is going to make climate change worse, because it takes too long, and this is a now problem. We need to jump on it now. And between solar and wind and energy efficiency, we can tackle climate change without spending the money on nuclear. It looks like there's about 500 nuclear plants in the world. It doesn't look like that number is ever going to grow above that. And new plants are being built, but old ones are retiring. So it's not going to exceed that. That's the good news. But the bad news is there's 500 plants that are getting older. And in my lifetime, there's been 5 meltdowns in 40 years. That's a meltdown every 8 years. So it's not a risk I think the world should be taking.
Norma?
And,
the nuclear future?
Yeah, the nuclear future. I think the nuclear age should be over for many, many, many reasons. I mean, because of the harm to living things and the planet. But as you yourself, you know better than I, it's going to be with us forever, right? The waste problem has not been solved, cannot be solved really, and I know you have studied what the best we can do under the circumstances are. I think that to live with this legacy as responsibly as possible, we have to start being accurate and honest in our willingness to understand the ongoing creation of victims and the past, and because you started by referring to the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the first nuclear chain reaction at the University of Chicago, I am trying to publicize, to introduce into the conversation the university's own participation in human radiation experiments, and particularly a distinctive case in which it used 102 students and staff members between 61 and 63 to study the effects of ingesting Nevada test site fallout. And we worry a lot about low-level radiation exposure now and ionizing. So I think the university and all of us around the country have to look into this past and see the implications for the present.
I want to thank you both. When the age started, it seemed like the nuclear genie was supposed to serve humanity. Now it almost seems like we've inverted that humanity is supposed to serve the nuclear genie somehow. So when half-lives become more important than full lives, something is really wrong with the system. I think Einstein once said that intellectuals solve problems, geniuses avoid them. So maybe as we move forward, we can avoid making the same mistakes again. I want to thank you for joining us for this program today, and we want to give special thanks to CAN TV Chicago, which we view as the jewel of the crown in public media in Chicago. Thank you very much, and thank both of you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.